Right, so it is 11:03 and we've got a goodly number of people on. So I think we can go ahead and get started if that's good with you, Doran.
Great, absolutely.
Okay, so just briefly, my name is Nicole Roberts, and I'm the development director here at the Coalition for Clean Air. And this webinar is one of our clean air conversations that we host periodically throughout the year, inviting our partners in to talk about the work that they're doing and how that blends together with the work that we're trying to do as the coalition. Um, CCA was established in 1971, and we believe everyone has the right to breathe clean air. We are California's only statewide organization that is exclusively dedicated to protecting public health, improving air quality, and preventing climate change. We advocate for policies and engage in outreach and educational activities with priorities including reducing air pollution from California's freight industry, ensuring that climate investments benefit the most disadvantaged communities, and promoting new clean air technologies. Our annual Clean Air Day event unites tens of thousands of Californians to take action for clean air. So don't forget to sign up and take the pledge at cleanairday.org. That's going to be on October 1st this year. We have programs like our All About Air Quality Boot Camp, which are training hundreds of local leaders to advocate for the health and safety of their communities. And we continue to lead air quality monitoring and other critical public health and education initiatives. In January, we were extremely proud to host a webinar about air quality and public health and safety during the Los Angeles wildfires that had an audience of nearly 12,000 folks. So that's the kind of responsive work that we want to be able to continue doing as well. And we are incredibly fortunate to have longtime dedicated partners like Foothill Transit to join us for that. And I believe Doran is going to talk a little bit about Foothill Transit and who they are, but I will introduce Doran Barnes, who is Foothill Transit's Chief Executive Officer. He oversees Foothill's 38 route system and manages the private contractors who operate and maintain the agency's 360 buses. Doran became Foothill Transit CEO in August of 2003. And he also serves as a member of the board of directors of Access Services, the regional paratransit operator for all of Los Angeles County. Previously served as CEO and general manager of Tulsa Transit in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Doran earned a master's degree in public administration from the University of Southern California and a bachelor's degree in international relations from UC Davis. And I am going to turn it over to Doran to go ahead and give us a brief overview of what Foothill Transit is and what Foothill Transit has been working on to transition to zero emissions.
No, thanks, Nicole. It's great to be with you and with everyone today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. As you were going through the background there, I was thinking back to this clean air journey that we've been on. And I actually served as the deputy CEO of Foothill Transit from 1997 to 2001. And it was in that time frame that we were having the big discussion about fuel technology and should we stick with diesel or move to compressed natural gas. And we've come a long way since then. We can talk about all of that during our time together. But it really has been quite a journey that our agency has been through over these many years, focusing on clean air, but also focusing on mobility. Really, our core function is to provide mobility options for the people in the San Gabriel and the Pomona Valley that's in eastern Los Angeles County. We are a joint powers authority made up of 22 cities plus the county of Los Angeles. Geographically, we run from the Angeles National Forest above Claremont, Laverne, Monrovia, all the way to Pasadena, going out to the county line and then serving the area just below the 60 freeway, circling around with El Monte, South El Monte, and Pasadena being the westernmost cities of our joint powers authority. But that doesn't limit us in terms of our geography. We actually operate a tremendous amount of service into downtown Los Angeles. Anyone who's been down in the financial district has probably seen our buses coming through that area, which is a key trip generator for us. We also have connecting service down into Orange County, into San Bernardino County. And really, we're part of this great network of transit operators throughout the region who are providing mobility to all of the residents of Los Angeles County and even beyond. So it's a big territory. We have lots of partners that we work with to make mobility options practical and usable for all of our residents. Our clean air journey has been really fascinating in that I mentioned our CNG diesel debate way back in the day, and we transitioned our fleet to compressed natural gas, and we use renewable natural gas on all of our vehicles, with the exception of our grid-powered battery electric buses and now our hydrogen fuel cell buses. And so we have continued to lean in as not only a regional leader, but a national leader in zero emission technologies in the transit space, which has been really cool.
When we were preparing to do this webinar, and I was talking to our CEO, Joe Liu,
Yeah.
he said he described your work, Doran, on moving transit towards zero emissions as heroic. And so really want to thank you for that and call you out for that. Can you say a little about what your personal motivation is? Because you've been leading the charge, haha, at Foothill personally for so long. What is it that motivates you to keep pushing that forward?
Well, I think there's a couple of things, and some of it intentional, and maybe some of it a little bit less intentional. I remember when I first came to Foothill Transit back in 1997. I arrived about this time of the year, actually. And I remember the first summer that I lived here, the Angeles National Forest and the foothills are not very far from our office. I think it was probably 6 months before I even knew that the mountains were there, because the air quality was so thick back in that area. And raising my daughters here and now my granddaughters, recognizing the poor air quality that we suffered with here, just not a great thing, and something that we all want to change. We all want to make improvements, and I think in the time that I've been here, you can now see those hills during the summer, and that's a credit to what's happened across all sectors, across not only the transport sector, but really the collective efforts that we've done to try to improve air quality. But we've still got further to go. And so I guess in some respects, it starts with a real personal interest in not only taking care of my family, but taking care of our community and all the folks that live here. I think the journey itself, in some respects, was almost a bit accidental, if you will. And I say that in that in 2000 and roughly 2008, when we had that economic downturn, Foothill Transit and other transit operators were very fortunate to get some additional federal funding to be able to invest in our communities. And at the time, I had a colleague who worked here at Foothill Transit who was very much involved with vehicle technology, with vehicle development, vehicle testing. And he came forward and he said, "Hey, we're getting some additional funding." And he really thought that battery electric vehicles were right on the cusp of moving from a really experimental space into more of the mainstream transit space. And he convinced me, and we convinced the board to give it a shot. And doing that, we implemented the first heavy duty fast charge battery electric buses deployed anywhere in North America. We did that right here in Pomona. And that was really the beginning of this incredible journey of looking at technologies and working to advance the technologies, learn about the technologies, share what we learned with the industry, so we can all be stronger and all really lean into this ultimate goal that we're trying to strive towards.
Yeah, we love that because that's one of our big priorities at CCA is um, how do we encourage the adoption of
Yeah.
technologies and make those accessible so that we can get to our zero emission and cleaner air goals now, not waiting until we get somewhere down the road. What can we do now to impact people's lives and make the air healthier and safer for us? It never ceases to amaze me. I've been living in California for just about 20 years myself. And the idea that California is so known for having the most innovative and aggressive policies on the environment, and yet at the same time, we still consistently have the most polluted, dirty cities in the country. It's such a contradiction. And, I think we all know that now more than ever, we need to be really leaning into ensuring that we don't roll back that progress that we've continued to make. Um, one
Yeah,
of
no,
the areas that I know we have a lot of alignment on, that CCA spends a lot of time on, is trying to uh, oppose freeway expansion as a solution to traffic problems and shipping and freight issues, because it is, again, seems contradictory, but is not the solution that people think it is. And I know that that's been a big issue for y'all as well, trying to encourage transit instead of highway expansion. So can you speak a little bit about that?
yeah, if you, and you may, some of the folks that are joining us today may have seen the images there. They've been done many different times, but if you look at the amount of space that bicycles and buses take compared to the amount of space cars take to move the same number of people, assuming one occupant per car, we can move a lot more people via transit on our current infrastructure if we simply improve and continue to lean in on improving that transit program and provide those options. So we don't need to build more freeways if we can encourage people to use other options. I think the reality of trying to expand freeways, particularly in really much of California, is that the cost to do that is so astronomical. And what we often find and what we've often seen is that the minute you open that expanded freeway, it immediately congests. And it does that because people change their travel patterns. So we're really trying to build our way out of a problem that we can never build our way out, if that makes sense, with expanding highways. What we can do, though, is use our current infrastructure in different ways to create more mobility options, have more frequent bus service, have more bus options, utilize things like express lanes. And we may talk about that a little bit more, but use our assets in a different way to create the mobility that we're all looking for without having to expand the freeway system to try to accomplish that.
Yeah, I would love for you to talk more about express
Yeah,
lanes, because I
yeah,
think that that is
yeah,
absolutely something that people think is going to be really helpful. But from what I understand, y'all have seen, I am from Texas.
that's great. I love it. I love it.
From what I understand, y'all have seen that the express lanes are not the solution that people think they are, and they've actually not been as helpful in pairing with transit options. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think express lanes can have a role in our mobility solutions. I think that really the key is how those express lanes are managed. And what we find with a lot of the HOV lanes and to some extent with the express lanes is that managing those express lanes effectively can be very tricky. And what I mean by that is that having folks that pay a toll to use an express lane, the positive to that is some of that funding goes back to pay for transit. And we've actually been the beneficiary of some of those toll revenues to be able to enhance our transit program. In fact, our battery electric double deck buses were paid for with tolling. So that's the upside. The downside is if the pricing and the flow of the toll lanes aren't managed effectively, they congest. And a congested toll lane where you have a bus sitting in traffic in a toll lane because it's congested defeats the purpose of having that toll lane efficiently move people that are on that transit vehicle to their destination. So it really is a very, very complex dance to get those toll lanes to function in a way that enhances mobility and doesn't have a negative impact on the transit. Easier said.
Is there technology that we could be using to manage those flows more efficiently that hasn't been adopted?
I think technology certainly plays a role. We're seeing technology play a bigger role in everything that we do, and technology is a part of it. Pricing is a part of it. Policy is a part of it. There's multiple layers to the cake, if you will, to ultimately reach that success that we're trying to accomplish. Infrastructure on those lanes is also an important part. In our area, the I-10 corridor going into downtown Los Angeles is really critical. It tends to congest at the 605 where you go from two express lanes down to one. That's a choke point. That's an infrastructure issue. that, ideally we would do infrastructure improvements to help manage the flow to that choke point better. Now, it's easy to say, we'll snap our fingers and bam, we'll have great infrastructure improvements. That's complex and that's costly. So, really with all of these things, I think we've got to keep leaning in. We've got to recognize that the solutions are often multifaceted and often very.
Yeah, I want to give you a little bit of an opportunity to make a pitch because generally our audience at CCA is pretty well informed on these kinds of policy and
Yeah.
advocacy issues. So why should we support funding for ongoing transit operations and not just new projects?
Well, I think that's it's two pieces to the puzzle. It's great to support new things. We all like new things. We like the new project that opens, the ribbon cutting, the excitement of the newness that's coming. We have to be careful though that we balance those new projects with our ability to maintain the core system. If we do an expanded project that ultimately we can't operate, we haven't met the goal. And so I think again, we've got to be looking very, very closely at how we balance those things. That as we expand, we have the ongoing capacity to be able to operate whatever it is we put in from an expansion standpoint. And that's really that's way bigger than Foothill Transit. That's all of our transit programs across the entire state. Expansion is great, but ongoing maintenance and operations is critical to make that investment pay off.
Okay, so I've got kind of a nitty-gritty policy question.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm gonna try to get to articulate this. The current administration is closely reviewing all kinds of funding for
Mm-hmm,
everything, and
mm-hmm.
that includes the $2 billion awarded by the Department of Energy to the ARCHES program
Yeah.
to establish a California hydrogen hub. We know that Foothill was granted $66 million from the ARCHES program to expand the zero-emission hydrogen fuel cell fleet and fueling infrastructure. So where did those projects stand right now, and what do we need to be aware of going forward as we continue to try to keep our zero-emission journey going?
Well, I think as we look back over the last 101 days, sort of the theme of a whole variety of topics has been uncertainty.
Mhm.
And we're adapting and pivoting and shifting in light of that uncertainty. I think as it relates to Arches specifically, and our hydrogen program for that matter, we at the moment, and we'll only have bragging rights for so long, but right now, as we sit here today, we have the largest fleet of hydrogen fuel cell buses in operation in North America. And I say that, yay, go us! California's awesome. We have some other partners that are also doing some really phenomenal work, and we talk to them all the time. There's some other great transit systems, and sooner or later they're going to jump over us in terms of fleet numbers. But we really view hydrogen as a fuel that has great potential in the heavy duty space, and it's worked really well for us. Part of our journey has been leaning in heavily with Arches in the grid work that they're doing, and really Arches focus has been to look at both the supply of hydrogen and the consumption. We're the consumption side. So there's got to be people that are consuming the hydrogen that is being produced. If producers produce it, nobody buys it, that's a problem. If we need it, nobody's producing it, that's a problem. Arch's goal is to marry that all together. And we really appreciate the partnership that Arches has brought. The $1 billion that may or may not come to California, I think we're watching that closely. We have our fingers crossed that that money is going to flow. In our conversations with the folks at Arches, they're really committed, and the state is really committed to making Arches work, period. And so there may be some pivots, there may be some shifts there, but I think the exciting thing is that our state and through Arches is really committed to advancing this hydrogen economy, and we really believe that fuel has great potential for a zero emission
You can we go back just a little bit and
future.
talk about how we got from initially the battery, the
Yeah,
electric battery
yeah.
to the hydrogen solution? Because I know that that's a big question for a lot of folks, and it's certainly something that we get asked at CCA a lot, and we want to
Absolutely.
give you the opportunity to talk about how Foothill made that decision and that transition.
We really believe that both fuel technologies have a place in our zero emission future. Battery electric, plug-in battery electric, or hydrogen fuel cell, which is really the other battery electric bus with the, the energy being produced in a different way. We started with plug-in vehicles. We started with short range fast charge vehicles and found that technology from a technological standpoint, it actually worked way better than we thought it would, which was great. What it also taught us, though, is that using electric power as a transportation fuel is very, very different than our traditional transportation fuels or even hydrogen. To give you an example, if we kind of go into the logistics realm, if you're a trucker and you buy a gallon of diesel fuel, that gallon of diesel fuel costs pretty much the same at 6 in the morning and 6 in the afternoon on a hot August day. If you're using electric power to power your bus or your logistics vehicle, the price of power at 6 a.m. in the morning on a hot August day versus 6 p.m. in the afternoon on a hot August day can vary wildly as much as a factor of 6 to 8 times. That's a whole different level of understanding in terms of how you use that fuel. So it adds a layer of complexity to how we fuel our vehicles to be able to meet the mission of the day. The other thing is a battery electric vehicle that is plugged into the grid generally requires somewhere in the 5 to 7 hours of charge time to be able to charge that battery pack. And so again, that adds a logistical complexity to delivering service that we haven't traditionally experienced. What we find with hydrogen is that a hydrogen bus functions exactly like a compressed natural gas powered bus. So we can fill that bus up in less than 10 minutes. It has a full 350-mile range on it. Again, it looks and acts just like a CNG powered bus. And the price of hydrogen for us is the same no matter what time of day you fuel that vehicle. So you don't have to deal with the variations of pricing that just naturally appear on the electric grid, but again, add complexity.
Do you think that we will see continued advancement of the battery electric technology that might eventually be able to catch up with that?
I think we will. I mean, I think all of these technologies are continuing to advance practically, seems like every day. We're really living in a world where I'll age myself a little bit, but I remember when I was a kid, the telephone got wired into the wall at grandma's house and it sat there for 20 years. Well, now we're getting a new iPhone or a new smartphone every 12 months because technology is advancing. And we're really living in a smartphone world, not a wired bell phone world. That analogy makes sense. Technology is changing and it's changing all the time. We have an order in place for our second round of hydrogen fuel cell buses. They will use a different fuel cell stack than the buses we bought 2 years ago. They'll have more power, they'll have more range, and that's just in 2 years' time. And so when you look at grid powered buses, when you look at hydrogen fuel cell buses, again, I think we're going to continue to see this advancement of the technology as we go forward. That's both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is things are getting better. The challenge is when we buy a bus, that bus has to be in service for 12 years. So we really lock in that technology for a 12-year span, even though it's advancing every couple of years going down. So.
And I'm assuming that there are other challenges that have been impacting that, like supply chain issues, and that there are unforeseen things that we can't even predict right now
Yeah, yeah, and
that may
uncertainty is
impact
the order of the day.
that.
Yeah, supply chain issues. When you hear about supply chain and the broader economy, narrow that down into the transportation space, the transit space, same level of uncertainty. Our buses are made in the United States. They have 70% American content and final assembly in the United States, but they do use some steel that comes from Canada. They have parts that are not sourced in the US, that are not manufactured in the US. And so depending on where they are sourced, what tariffs are in place, supply chain availability, all of that impacts us in terms of keeping vehicles on the road and procuring new vehicles to replace old ones.
Yeah, and I know that in the work that you've been doing where you work with a lot of other agencies and trying to expand the technology. I'm sure a lot of like smaller communities are really facing challenges with being able to even approach the kind of work that Foothill has done. What kind of challenges do you see there? What kinds of things could we be doing to help accelerate that for some of those other communities?
Yeah, I think, we're lucky here in that we're big enough to be able to lean into these technologies. We're not, we're a mid-sized transit system, but we are fortunate that we've been able to lean into these technologies. Some of our fellow transit systems that are a bit smaller in other communities, they don't necessarily have the same level of resources that we can apply to advancing technology. One of the great things about the transit space is that at the end of the day, no matter what community we're in, our ultimate goal is to make the lives of the people that live in those communities better, help them reach the destinations that make their lives, that improve their lives. Um, Related to that, we are really great about sharing not only success stories, but also sharing what didn't go so well. Because sometimes the bumps in the road can be even more valuable than the success stories. And so through various groups, conversations are happening. Through the coalition's conversation here, we're able to share both the good things and the challenging.
And then when we think about going back to the question about like federal funding, do you see the state of California continuing to step up to support that kind of transition, not just with Foothill, but with the other communities in California and continuing to make that a priority? Because of course, we mentioned the smaller communities. So often those are the most disadvantaged communities, the ones where the
Right.
people are being the most impacted by having dirty diesel buses on their
Very true.
roads every day. So do you see that as something that California is going to continue to prioritize in a challenging time?
I hope so. That's a fair answer. I think one of the big challenges that we've got to continue to lean in on is, we want to operate a zero emission fleet. And I think as I talk to my colleagues up and down the state, big systems, small systems, the goal of being zero emission is a common goal that we all share. The challenge with that goal is that we haven't come anywhere close to cost parity from the traditional propulsion systems to the zero emission propulsion systems. And so for us right now, for example, a hydrogen fuel cell bus is almost twice as expensive as a compressed natural gas powered bus for essentially the same bus. The naked eye, you wouldn't necessarily know what propulsion system is in that bus, but it's a factor of 2x in terms of cost. That's a real challenge. And that's where, we've got to look to the state, we've got to look to any funding sources that we can, that we can go to be able to continue on this journey. And I think part of the conversation has to be always this balance between wanting to achieve our zero emission goals, but also wanting to be able to provide core mobility services. And we haven't hit it yet, but I know in some communities there's some conversation about, do you go zero emission and cut service, or do you maintain service levels but also maintain current technologies? Neither one of those are great choices by any stretch. And ideally, we want to be able to maintain services and have zero emission, but that takes resources. And so we're hopeful that the state will lean in. We're hopeful that there will be federal funding that comes on a discretionary basis. That's always up to the whims of the political cycles in Washington. So we'll see.
And I guess one of the roles that an organization like ours can take on is to try to tell that story in a bigger picture way as far as like the community health impact and how all of those big picture costs fit together. And that if we're making the investment at this end with things like zero emission transit, that's going to have these bigger picture impacts on public health and costs for lost wages and emergency room visits and lost schooling and things like that.
Yeah, it really amplifying that message, that story is absolutely critical. And I firmly believe there are huge positive economic benefits to our communities by providing mobility options that have zero emissions tied to them. But we've got to have the resources to be able to make all of that happen, to make that flow through. And therein lies the challenge. And it's not necessarily you've got $10, do you put it in this bucket or this bucket? It's the down the road, you're going to have to put $10 in the health bucket because we didn't take care of the air quality bucket along the way. But it's not a direct correlation. And so that's where amplifying that message, absolutely vital. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a difficult, it seems like an obvious story, but it's also a challenging story to lay out for folks.
It really is. Yeah, no, absolutely.
So if you were given unlimited resources, what would be the newest,
Yeah.
latest, greatest thing? What would you want to, I mean, tell me, are you secretly working on teleporters in the back room somewhere?
Well, that's down the road. We haven't that'd be a thing. Um, yeah, teleporters down the road would be great. That would really clear up our traffic congestion problems. But for the moment, we are continuing to lean in on our zero emission journey. The buses that we're buying, we actually have 19 hydrogen fuel cell buses on order. We're getting ready to order 30 additional hydrogen fuel cell buses. And then on top of that, we have 24 grid powered double deck buses that are on order. And I mentioned earlier, we have two grid powered double deck buses in our fleet today. They are the first two grid powered double deck buses in operation in North America, which is pretty cool. If you're here in the LA area, you might every once in a while spot them. I kind of call them the unicorns. You occasionally see a unicorn in the wild, and every once in a while you'll spot them, but they're running in daily service. We're going to expand that fleet to 24, and those will be grid powered buses. So again, looking at both technologies, using both technologies, both have a role going forward. It's a matter of how we match up those use cases for those two technologies. So for now we're doing pretty good. I guess my real dream would be that all of our partners would have the resources to be able to follow that same path. And that's where the dream gets a little fuzzier because again, it takes a lot of resource to be able to get to this zero emission future that we all want.
Is there besides the cost that is associated with charging a battery electric bus versus a hydrogen fuel cell bus, were there other logistical considerations? I seem to remember that, literally like being able to drive up a hill because you are a foothill,
Right,
that's
right, right.
part of the issue as well. Is that true, or is it just distance, things like that?
It's I think the biggest challenges have to do with the charging of the vehicles, the charging infrastructure required at our
Hmm.
maintenance facilities. That's a land constraint. So that's a challenge. And then, beyond that, operator performance is certainly a topic that we think about a lot. We do find, with a CNG bus, pretty much any operator can operate that vehicle throughout its service because there's enough fuel on board to take into account the variations of how operators perform. With an electric bus, you reduce that margin. Particularly with a grid powered bus, you reduce that margin. And even with a hydrogen fuel cell bus, keeping in mind that a hydrogen fuel cell bus is really a fuel cell that is creating electric power that goes into a battery pack that then operates the vehicle. So a hydrogen fuel cell bus is a battery electric bus. It's just where the electricity comes from, like I say, is a little bit different. So at the end of the day, you need to have a bus that's robust enough to be able to handle operator performance ranging from, super fuel efficient to not so fuel efficient. And that's human nature. There's always operators that are really fuel efficient and some that are less fuel efficient. We want to move the ones at the less fuel efficient range forward, but you've always got to be able to account for that. So we have seen scenarios where a fully grid powered bus will have range limitations. If an operator isn't careful how they use the fuel, it can draw the batteries down much more quickly. We've even seen situations where topography will make a difference. So we have a route that it literally has a hill. It's just a little hill, but that hill has a negative impact on battery operation that has to be accounted for in how that bus gets done.
You gotta get out and push? No.
No, well, generally having customers get out and push is not on our number one on our list. So yeah.
No, definitely not.
Uh,
Um, So, sort of related to that, I'm wondering what challenges and opportunities you've seen regarding labor around changing this technology. Has that been an issue? Is that something that Foothills had to address internally? I'm sure there must be opportunities for training folks on new technologies as well.
There are for sure, and I think all if I look back at our technology journey, so we moved from diesel to compressed natural gas. That's still the bulk of our fleet is compressed natural gas. Then we went to battery electric, which added a whole different realm from a maintenance and a labor standpoint. And now we're focusing a lot on hydrogen fuel cell. And when I think about that, the hydrogen is a gaseous fuel like CNG. It goes through the fuel cell to produce the electric power that then goes into an electric battery pack, like our old electric buses. And so it's really marrying the technologies together as we move forward. All of it requires training, all of it requires new skill levels. Our maintenance technicians have to have the knowledge of how these systems work. They really become, in some respects, almost electrical engineers as opposed to traditional bus maintainers. So, updating and providing skills, providing training is critical to make sure we can support these technologies going.
So is that something that Foothill's been working on internally, or are you partnering with other like local colleges and unions and things like that to create those programs?
I'll go with option C, all of the above.
Excellent.
Yes. Yeah, it's a combination of training that's being done here locally, as well as partnerships in partnerships with the vendors that are providing these technologies, um, consortium training that's happening. We also benefit from the fact that we actually contract with two private companies to handle our day-to-day operations. They bring not only national but international expertise to bear as well. So we're looking at all of these training avenues to be able to have the folks that are here on the ground have the core skills they need to make the technology keep going.
How do we compare with other countries? Is there who's doing it best? Who should we be looking to? Well, obviously y'all are doing it best, but
Yeah,
are there models out there that are just blowing everybody else out of the water that we should be aspiring to? Does that even exist right now?
I would say the Europeans are well, two different fronts. The Europeans are way ahead of us in terms of using hydrogen and using and deploying zero emission vehicles. And so there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what's happening in Europe. Some of them we can apply here. Some are a little more challenging to apply here. If you take a look at the number of buses that are deployed in Europe versus the United States, they have more transit, they have more transit buses, they have more bus manufacturers because of that. And because of the Buy America requirements that are tied to our federal funding, we can't buy European buses and bring them to the US and deploy them here. So it's good to know what their technology is and to see what they're doing. Again, some of it's transferable, some of it's less transferable. I think the other space, and in current times, a little more challenging to look at. But if you look at what's happening in China, they've had huge deployments of battery electric, plug-in battery electric vehicles, numbers that are vastly bigger than what we've seen in the United States. Lessons to be learned, but a little bit more difficult to be able to transfer that knowledge over.
Mhm.
So we know they're doing some great things. I don't know what the current number is, but the city of Shenzhen has hundreds of battery electric buses in operation. What we don't really know is what are the details behind that operational performance.
Sure. And in Europe, for example, is the further advancement there due to a longer history of just everyone embracing public transit as a normal day-to-day option, political will that we haven't seen here?
Yeah, I think part of it is, the European culture, if you will, around transportation is very different than the United States history. Um, a lot of the European cities are much older than the cities here in the United States. They were developed at a time really when public transit was often a horse-drawn carriage but the cities became much more dense because of the transportation networks. If you look at city of San Francisco, which developed earlier than the Los Angeles area, it has a more dense footprint, largely driven by transit, by the cable cars, by the streetcars. So you had that level of density that here in Los Angeles, we don't see quite the same way. Our community here in Southern California was largely developed, and transit's partly responsible for it, but the development philosophy was work in the city, live in the country, which meant less dense developments. That's a lot of our suburban communities surrounding Los Angeles, that then became, initially were linked by our streetcar system, but then really became dominated by our highway system. And so to do what they do in Europe here really requires almost some development changes of a foundational level that would be tough.
Yeah, real psychological,
Yeah. So I
more
mean,
propaganda campaigns.
yeah, well, exactly. And I think it's great to look at what the Europeans have done. It's great to look at what other communities have done. Every community's program is driven by the development of that community.
Yeah.
And so we can pull ideas to some extent, but they aren't necessarily, you can't just lift them up and drop them here and say, wow, we're going to do what they do in London or Paris here in Los Angeles. You know,
But we can also, give people ways to experience what transit can do for them because the default is I have
totally.
to drive to this place and
Oh,
it's going to
yeah.
be terrible.
Yeah.
But then, you look at like for me going down to the Hollywood Bowl,
Right.
I can't even imagine trying to drive down there anymore.
Exactly.
Wouldn't
Exactly.
do it.
Nope. Exactly.
Wouldn't do it at all. And they've made it so much easier to get down there on LA Metro and then with the shuttles and everything, for example. And then, we've got our Clean Air Day campaign where we have so many transit agencies offering free and reduced fares on that day to encourage people to give transit a try and see what it's like, be able to listen to your music, read a book, do all kinds of other things while other people deal with the traffic. So,
Well,
I mean, we have we're probably kind of preaching to the choir here on
yeah, yeah.
with our audience, but so I want to know what are your last thoughts in terms of the most important messages that folks who are the choir here
Yeah.
should take away from this conversation if they want to be able to support more transit options in general and specifically more cleaner, greener transit for everyone.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of takeaways. One, I mean, transit in and of itself really is that clean, green mobility solution, and leaning in on providing the best program that we can for the community. That's the foundation of what we do to support the clean air efforts all the way around. So that's one point I would put out there. I think the second point is as we really strive to have not only the mobility solutions, but also have the zero emission solutions that ultimately we want to get to. There's still a lot of things to be figured out. There's still a lot of complexity behind this. And in some cases, there are some trade-offs that are difficult trade-offs to look at. We've got to have thoughtful conversations about what those trade-offs are. It's great to want vast, fabulous, wonderful mobility and zero emission vehicles, but sometimes our appetite's a little bit bigger than our wallet, if you will. We've got to make sure we're being thoughtful about how we move those two things together and not sacrifice one for the other. But like I say, be thoughtful about it, given just the incredible complexity that we're working
Well, we've got a little bit less than 15 minutes. Do we have any questions coming in the chat? I haven't seen anything yet. Have they been being messaged to our team yet?
I
Okay.
haven't received any questions. If anyone has any, they can submit it in the chat.
Now is the time. Otherwise, I'm gonna keep asking questions myself because, because obviously I don't know all the technical details, but I love to hear about it. Do you
Well,
know
don't
are
get too
any
technical because I'm the policy guy. So, but I'm really fortunate to work with some great people here who bring in the technical expertise. It really takes that whole spectrum of folks, within the transit world to be able to make these projects work.
Well, we're generally policy folks over on this end too. And can you tell us, is there any legislation in the California legislature that y'all are watching this year that we should be looking at or making calls about, things like that?
Yeah, well, we haven't really touched on this, and I do think it's an important thread in this broader conversation. Um, transit systems across the country receive only a very small portion of their funding through the fare box direct. Our fare box recovery ratio, or the percentage of revenue that comes from the fare box, it's hovering around 7%.
Wow.
So, and that's by design. Here in Los Angeles County and other parts of the state, the story's different but similar. Here the voters of Los Angeles County have voted to tax themselves. There are 4.5 cent sales tax measures that fund transit operations. And because of that, we've been able to keep fares low, which encourages people to ride, which we think is really important. So it's not that there's a little bit of design behind the low fare box recovery ratio. But what that means is that for us, sales tax revenue is a key funding source to be able to support the program. So as the economy goes, so goes the support for the transit program. So we're watching the economy very closely. I think the other dynamic that's come into play, again, this is a statewide challenge. We could probably do a whole separate webinar on housing and housing challenges and how all that plays in. What we've seen is that labor costs have gone up because cost of living here is high, and they've gone up at a rate that's much higher than sales tax revenue receipts and fare box revenue. So that creates a gap, and different systems are facing that gap sooner than later. What we could be facing is the challenge of having to actually reduce the transit program because the resources aren't there to keep the current program in place. I say all of that because there is some legislation that's being considered in Sacramento that would provide some additional funding to help bridge that gap. And so with the entire program, it's all about the resources we have to be able to invest those resources in providing mobility as well as providing zero emission solutions that are critical. So I could wrap all that up to say, tell Sacramento to send as much cash as they can, because that translates into services and that translates into benefits to our community.
Well, unfortunately, that's the solution to
A
all
lot
of
of
our
problems. I know.
I did just see a question come in asking, Turaj Khalili asked if we can rely on battery solution in electric vehicles as the reliable, long-term, sustainable solution.
Well, I believe we can. And I think it's not only what's happening in the transit space, but in other transportation spaces. We've seen great success with the private auto space, zero in electric vehicles. We're now approaching, in some cases, 15 years of history with battery electric vehicles, and they're becoming more robust. The range is becoming stronger and better. There are still questions that we need to work through, but I really see hydrogen fuel cell and battery electric buses as being a core part of our future in the transit space going forward.
We've got Brandy Keith wanted you to please repeat the breakdown of grid-powered buses in use.
Our current fleet right now, 360 buses. Of those, we have 33 hydrogen fuel cell buses. We have 14 longer range grid powered buses, and we have 2 battery electric double deck buses. We had the shorter range buses that we purchased or put in service in 2010. Those have been retired out of the fleet now. So they're no longer in operation.
So we've got a question from Claudio Molina wanting to know how about the infrastructure costs of fuel cell compared to electric charging.
Fuel cell infrastructure compared to electric charging. Fuel cell infrastructure compared to electric charging is a lot cheaper.
Is it?
We're looking at well, we're getting ready to install a second hydrogen fuel cell fueling station. That'll be an $11 million station that'll support 100 buses. Electric buses, we're looking at about $300,000 per bus in electric infrastructure to support those electric vehicles. So have to do the quick math on that. but I think the broader question on that is if you say, what's the total infrastructure cost for a fuel cell bus versus a grid powered electric bus? Meaning the bus and the fueling infrastructure. And when you add those equations in, a fully electric bus is less expensive than a hydrogen fuel cell bus. So for the most part, we look at both of those technologies having a total infrastructure cost that's pretty close to each
And some Tamar de la Concepcion is asking about removable batteries. I would think they're just very big batteries.
other.
That might be a logistical
They're
challenge.
big, yeah. And I've heard that concept as well, where you kind of pull in and you take out one battery, charge one set of batteries, and put in another set of batteries, and then you're good, ready to go. I think conceptually it could work, maybe, but it would require, you kind of have to figure out how to make that switch out very quick and efficient.
Mm.
And I think the way that the batteries are currently installed in the vehicles, that's neither quick or efficient. To be able to kind of pull into the fueling station, pop out one battery pack and pop on the next one, there'd have to be a lot of development to be able to make all that work. I
And I'm
haven't
sure
heard.
there's not a ton of interchangeability between the different like manufacturers.
Well, right.
It's
I'm
like
Yeah,
we barely can get agreement on what kind of charger to use for our cell phones
right.
across the
Well, and
board.
that seems to change every other year. So, yeah,
That was
no,
my biggest problem with the movie Avatar was that they had universal connectivity with the whole planet, and we can't even charge our phones with the same cord.
no, exactly. I'm with you 110%, and you're spot on with there'd have to be some commonality of design. There'd have to be again, I think conceptually it could be done. I'm not aware of anybody in the transit space that's currently working on that approach.
But something to be thinking about again as we like keep moving forward. Um, we've got a question from Robbie Lucio. What model buses are in Foothill Transit's BEB fixed route fleet? And
So
sizes and challenges with procuring parts. Again, going to our
yeah. So our hydrogen fuel cell buses were built by New Flyer. New Flyer builds a little over half of the buses provided in North America. So all of our hydrogen fuel cell buses are, like I say, New Flyer buses. Our two double deck buses were manufactured by Alexander Dennis. Alexander Dennis is owned by New Flyer Industries, so a different branch of the same organization. And then our long range battery electric buses were manufactured by Proterra. And if anybody's familiar with the Proterra story, we could probably do a whole other hour on that. So with the Proterra buses, there are huge challenges with getting parts for those vehicles. For those that may not be aware, Proterra was a company that was created specifically to build battery electric buses. They went through a bankruptcy proceeding. Phoenix Motor Cars now owns them. But as you can imagine, with the bankruptcy proceeding, change in ownership, there's been a lot of moving parts, if you will, with that company. So it's been a little more challenging to be able to keep those up and operating. I think beyond that, parts availability is a challenge. We've seen ebbs and flows in the supply chain. During the COVID period, when the supply chain was interrupted, that created some real problems. And now the situation with tariffs is something we're watching closely in terms of supply chain interruptions that could impact our ability to maintain the fleet.
So besides telling the legislature to send us all the money, are there any threats policy-wise that are coming down the pike? Threats to funding or access?
Well, I think I wouldn't say well, I wouldn't. Let me characterize it in two different areas. I think at the
Who
state.
are the villains, Doran? Who do we need to go after?
Well, yeah, that's. I'll put the sunny side on the whole thing.
I won't get you in trouble.
No worries. I do think that the reauthorization of cap and trade is something to keep an incredibly close eye on. There is funding for the transit program that comes through the cap and trade program. And so we're trying to lean in as heavy as we can on the importance of renewing that program and maintaining the commitment to transit funding coming out of cap and trade. So that's a big, big, giant thing in Sacramento to definitely keep an eye on.
Yeah, we're definitely leaning into that as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, I'm sure, absolutely. And again, we have lots of topics for future webinars. That's another one.
Is there a bill number for bus funding in Sacramento?
There's not a bill number for bus funding. So bus funding largely comes through the Transit Intercity Capital Rail Program, TIRCIP, which is funded in large part through cap and trade. So it all kind of links back. So that's again where the cap and trade becomes so incredibly important. So I'd say at the state level, that's probably one of the biggest things to look at in its entirety, but narrowing part of it to the transit program. At the federal level, there are a couple of discretionary funding programs that historically have provided funding for zero emission and low emission vehicles. The low and no emission bus program through the Federal Transit Administration is one of those, and then the federal bus and bus facility program is another one of those. Those funds are awarded on a discretionary basis. So essentially everybody in the country says, hey, here's what I need. Here's why it's really important. It all gets ranked and evaluated. It's unclear as to what that funding program will look like over the next couple of years. There's been some discussion that the low and no emission bus program may focus less on no emission and more on low emission. It's also unclear as to where those dollars will flow geographically. So
there are no programs that are specifically on the chopping block with the current reconciliation bill that you know of?
not at the moment. Uncertainty is the key. Yeah. I mean, I think at the federal level, funding for any programs is something that we have to be keeping our eye on. We talked about arches a little bit ago. That if that $1 billion goes away, I believe arches will still be here. I think arches will still do good work. It'll be harder to do that good work with $1 billion less to work.
Yeah.
At the federal level, there haven't been any specific proposals to reduce transit funding, but again, I think we have to keep our eye on the ball.
Right.
Hopefully, we won't have to have that conversation.
Well, speaking of funding, I'm going to make a quick pitch for folks. I got a lot of thank yous for the presentation. We want to thank you for being here today. Doran, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise with us. If you are able to help support Coalition for Clean Air's work, we are going to be up in Sacramento working on these issues that Doran's been talking about to try to make sure that we have all the funding that we can possibly get to support public transit and to support cleaner zero emission technologies, and to be able to continue to provide webinars like this. Foothill sponsored this webinar, and we are so grateful for your partnership. And please get in touch with us if you have ideas. Doran, you mentioned at least 3 other topics that we could do another hour on. If folks have other suggestions for topics that they're interested in hearing about, let us know. And just thank you so much, Doran. Any last words you want to get out to the folks?
No, I really appreciate the interest in the topic, and Nicole, appreciate the great work that the coalition is doing and the partnership that we've had with the coalition. This really is an effort with all of us having to lean in and talk about the challenges. This isn't easy, but we've got to hit these challenges head on and continue to keep our eye on that goal of a clean, sustainable transportation future. That's what we want.
Way to keep the wheels turning and the metaphors going.
That's right. I give you all kinds of metaphors. Maybe that's a webinar too. So
there we go.
Good stuff.
All right. Well, thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you all. And we'll talk to you soon. May every breath you take be a breath of fresh air.
I love that. That's great. Take care.
Bye.